Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking the intense, kind of hidden science of social exclusion. But more importantly, we're going to build a really practical guide for creating genuinely inclusive environments. We're dissecting a fundamental human experience here. We're looking at why being ignored hurts so deeply, and how we can use that exact science to design spaces where people actually feel like they belong.
So let's just jump right in with a question we've all unfortunately felt the sting of at some point. Whether it's being left unread by a friend, getting the silent treatment from a partner, or just being completely talked over in a meeting. Why does that feeling of being excluded physically hurt? Why does it literally feel like a punch to the gut?
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the biology of social pain, trace the history of ostracism, confront the modern loneliness epidemic, and finally, look at designing inclusive environments. All right, Section 1, the biology of social pain. Let's look at the hard biological case for why we crave inclusion so deeply. The neuroscience here is absolutely mind-blowing. Functional MRI scans prove that our brains process a social insult using the exact same alarm network as a physical injury. When you stub your toe, your brain's dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DACC, and the anterior insula light up. Well, guess what? When you were socially rejected, those exact same regions fire up. Your brain literally cannot tell the difference between physical trauma and social pain. The alarm bells ring just as loudly for both. To understand why, we have to look back at our evolution. For our hunter-gatherer ancestors, being pushed out of the group wasn't just a bummer. It was, frankly, a death sentence. It meant starving or getting eaten by a predator. So, natural selection wired us with this ostracism detection system. It's this hypersensitive biological alarm that triggers immediate reflexive pain at the slightest hint of being left out, basically forcing us to scramble back to the safety of the herd.
There's this famous 2003 study known as the cyberball experiment that brilliantly illustrates just how deeply ingrained this system is. Participants played this really simple, meaningless virtual ball toss game on a computer. Eventually, the pixelated computer avatars just stopped throwing the ball to the human player. That's it. Yet this incredibly brief exclusion by literal lines of code immediately dropped participants' self-esteem, made them angry, and totally hijacked their minds with survival-level stress. Even when we logically know it doesn't matter, our brains react as if our lives are on the line.
Moving to Section 2, the history of social ostracism. Because our brains are universally wired to fear isolation, societies throughout history have recognized this vulnerability and, well, they've weaponized it.
Using the silent treatment to enforce social order is literally a tale as old as time. Around 500 BC, Athenian democracy formalized this with literal ostracism, where citizens voted on pottery shards to exile people for a decade. By the 2nd century BCE, the Hindu Manusmriti codified social outcasts, essentially rendering an entire class of people invisible. Fast forward to 1656, and we see the religious shunning of people like philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who was excommunicated and banished from his community.
The crucial takeaway here is that public exile across completely different cultures and centuries was purposefully designed to erase a person's civic voice and signal community disapproval. It was a socially lethal tool. And while we aren't voting on pottery shards anymore, this historical instinct is still very much alive today. Which brings us to Section 3, the modern loneliness epidemic. Today, the biological stakes of being ignored haven't changed one bit, but our methods definitely have.
Welcome to the new ostracism. In our hyper-connected digital world, we've invented incredibly efficient ways to trigger each other's ostracism detection systems. We see it in the sudden silent breakups of ghosting. We see it in subtle workplace exclusion that just kills motivation. We see it in algorithms that quietly hide dissenting voices to keep us trapped in echo chambers. And of course, we see it in cancel culture and online mass shunning, where that ancient human fear of banishment is amplified to a global scale. It is an absolute minefield for our ancient brains.
In this constant triggering of our social pain network, it's created a massive systemic health crisis. Decades of longitudinal data clearly show that chronic loneliness is not just an emotional issue, it's a profound physical health risk. Severe isolation carries a mortality hazard that literally rivals clinical obesity. It's directly linked to higher rates of cardiovascular disease, dementia, and severe mental health burdens. I mean, check out this staggering figure derived from a massive meta-analysis of over 300,000 people. Having strong social relationships gives you a 50% higher survival rate than those with weak ties.
Let that sink in for a second. Connection literally keeps you alive longer. To put that urgency into even sharper perspective, researchers have equated the physical danger of being socially isolated to smoking 15 cigarettes every single day. That is the actual biological toll that prolonged exclusion and the resulting flood of stress hormones takes on your body.
All right, on to our final section, designing inclusive environments. Since we know that exclusion is a life-or-death neurochemical crisis, let's pivot to our toolkit. How do we take this data and actually build better environments?
Systemically, as leaders and designers, we've got to engineer our spaces to counteract isolation. In healthcare, doctors are actually adopting social prescribing, literally referring lonely patients to community groups instead of just handing them a pill. In education, it means robust bystander intervention to stop ostracism early. In tech, it means tweaking algorithms to flag toxic ignore behaviors and actively promote social cohesion. And in the workplace, it means structuring wellness programs that specifically target social well-being and respectful dialogue.
But what about on a personal level? If you are the one feeling isolated, there are evidence-based steps to buffer that sting. Step 1 is cognitive reappraisal, learning to reinterpret social slights so you don't immediately internalize them as a threat to your survival. Step 2 is proactive outreach. You don't need 1,000 friends. You just need to strengthen a small, close circle to buffer broader exclusion. And step 3 is actively seeking new groups, like a local meetup or a positive online community, to really rebuild your fundamental sense of belonging. Which brings us to our ultimate goal here. The famous Harvard longevity study really hit the nail on the head. Relationships predict long, happy lives. When we implement policies and personal actions that promote community, we aren't just making people feel warm and fuzzy. We're actively lowering stress hormones, calming those DACC brain alarms, and, quite literally, saving lives.
Understanding all of this completely changes how we should interact with the world. You now hold the power to change someone's neurochemistry today simply by acknowledging them. You actually have the tools to combat this loneliness epidemic in your own circles. So I'll leave you with this final thought to carry into your workplaces, your schools, and your communities. What will you do today to make someone feel seen?